I met my girlfriend at 31, with her being 29. It was both of our first relationship, first time holding hands, first kiss, and all of that. At 31, I had come to terms with the fact that I was still alone. It wasn't something I wore like a badge of honor, nor did I consider myself particularly unlucky. It was simply my reality, a quiet acceptance of the path my life had taken. Friends and family had long stopped asking, and I had learned to navigate the world without the weight of romantic expectation hanging over me. Sure, there were fleeting moments of longing, but they were easily drowned in the humdrum of daily life. I was content in my own way until I met her. She was 29, and I noticed her for the first time at a mutual friend's birthday party. We had spoken briefly in the past, but this time was different. I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way she laughed, or the easy way she moved through the crowd, but I felt drawn to her. We found ourselves standing next to each other by the snacks, exchanging awkward pleasantries before the conversation took on a life of its own. Her eyes held something I hadn't seen before, a curiosity, a gentle warmth, as though she had been waiting for someone without even knowing it. I never believed in the idea of love at first sight, but in that moment, I felt something stir inside me, a flutter that I hadn't experienced before. It was as if a door I had kept locked for so long had suddenly creaked open, and I was standing there, unsure whether to step through or not. The night went on, and we gravitated toward each other, naturally, like we were tethered. We spoke about everything and nothing, hours slipping by without either of us noticing. In a room full of people, it was as though we were the only two there. I found myself laughing at things she said, even the ones that didn't quite make sense. Her presence was calming, and I noticed the way her smile reached her eyes, making everything feel lighter. As the evening wound down and the party started to dwindle, I felt a reluctance to let go. That's when she asked if I wanted to walk her home. The simple question felt so much bigger in that moment, a quiet invitation to continue the evening, to step further into the unknown. I agreed, and as we walked side by side, there was an awkwardness I couldn't shake. We hadn't touched yet, not even a brush of the arm, but the space between us felt charged with possibility. I couldn't help but wonder if she felt the same pull that I did. It was then, standing at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, that she reached out. It was hesitant and sure, but as her fingers brushed against mine, I felt an electric shock run through me. My breath caught, and for a brief moment, everything else ceased to exist. It wasn't just her hand in mine. It was the weight of years spent alone, the hesitations and fears that had kept me from reaching out to anyone, falling away. The world seemed to hold its breath as we stood there, the sound of traffic fading into the background. I don't think either of us said anything in that moment, but it didn't matter. There was something simple yet profound in the way our fingers intertwined, as if we had both been waiting for this moment our entire lives. I had never held someone's hand before, not like this. The touch felt unfamiliar yet completely natural, as though it was always meant to be. As the days passed, we saw each other more and more. Moment felt like a first, the first time I brushed her hair behind her ear, the first time I noticed the little things about her, how she always wore the same perfume, how she had a habit of fidgeting when she was nervous. Every gesture felt like an uncharted territory, and I had no map, no guide. All I had was the simple desire to explore it, to understand her in ways I had never understood anyone else. Our first kiss happened slowly, gently. We had spent the evening at a park, walking and talking until the sun dipped behind the horizon. The air had grown cool, and we stood under the dim light of a street lamp, neither of us knowing how to end the night. The silence between us was comfortable, but there was an intensity in the way our eyes met, a quiet yearning that neither of us could ignore. I remember the feeling of her lips against mine, soft, hesitant at first, as though we were both testing the waters. But once they met, once that connection was made, something inside me shifted. It was as though I had been waiting for this moment my entire life, as if the kiss itself had unlocked a part of me I had never known. I felt a wave of emotions rush over me, fear, excitement, tenderness, each one crashing over the other in rapid succession. It wasn't a grand, dramatic kiss. It was just a simple, quiet moment between two people who had no expectations other than to see where this new, delicate connection would go. But for me, it was everything. It was my first kiss, the beginning of something I had never thought would happen for me. It wasn't just the physicality of it. It was the understanding that, for the first time in my life, I was willing to open myself up to someone fully, without hesitation. And she, too, was taking the same step. In the weeks that followed, we continued to explore our relationship, navigating the uncharted waters of firsts. There were more hand-holding moments, more shared glances that spoke volumes, but it wasn't just the romantic milestones that stood out, it was the way we made each other feel seen. There was a sense of ease between us, a mutual understanding that we were both figuring this out for the first time, and that it was okay to be imperfect. We were allowed to make mistakes, to stumble, to grow, and we did together. But with each passing day, I couldn't shake the fear that perhaps I wasn't enough, that maybe she would realize, as I had so many times, that I was too much of a work in progress. She was beautiful, confident, someone who had a history I could never understand. And yet, when she looked at me, there was no judgment, only the same curiosity that had drawn me to her in the beginning. It was as though she saw the person I was becoming, not the person I once was. And I, in turn, saw the strength and vulnerability in her that I had never noticed before. The truth was, we were both beginners in this relationship, just as we were beginners in love. We didn't know the right words to say all the time, nor did we always know how to express what we felt, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the space we were creating for each other, a space where both of us could be raw, real, and vulnerable. We had no past relationships to compare it to, no expectations of what this should look like. All we had was each other, learning together, one moment at a time. It's strange, looking back now. At 31, I had thought my time had passed, that I was too old for new beginnings. But in meeting her, I realized that love doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't follow a timeline or a set of rules. Love is something that can come when you least expect it, when you are both willing to take the leap, even if you have no idea where it will lead. And as I stood there, holding her hand for the thousandth time, I knew that this, our first kiss, our first hand-holding, our first everything, wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship deepened in ways neither of us had anticipated. What had started as tentative steps, filled with awkwardness and hesitation, gradually transformed into something more comfortable, more secure. Every day felt like a small discovery. We learned how to be with each other, how to give space when needed, how to offer comfort without being asked. At first, it felt surreal, this new reality we were building. I had never imagined that at 31, I would experience all of these firsts: first hand-holding, first kiss, first moments of genuine intimacy. It wasn't just about the physical acts, it was about the emotional depth that accompanied them. I began to understand that love was never something that could be planned or forced. It happened when it was meant to, and often when you least expected it. But even with all the joy and wonder that came with this relationship, there were challenges, too. As we grew closer, I found myself battling old insecurities. I had never felt worthy of love in the way that others seemed to. My past had been filled with rejection, loneliness, and missed opportunities. I had built up walls to protect myself, convinced that I would never find someone who would truly understand me. And now, with her, I was faced with the paradox of feeling both overwhelmed and terrified. She, too, had her own fears. Though she was confident and outgoing, she had never been in a relationship before, and there were moments when I could see that vulnerability in her eyes. It wasn't a weakness, though it was a shared humanity, a recognition that love was something we both needed to learn. I saw her as someone who was discovering parts of herself through me, just as I was doing the same through her. There were nights when we lay in bed, talking until the early hours, sharing pieces of our past that had never been spoken aloud before. I confessed to her the loneliness that had marked most of my life, how I had watched others find their partners and wondered what was wrong with me. She listened, with quiet understanding, never judging, always accepting. In return, she told me of her own struggles, how she had spent years believing she wasn't enough, and sure if anyone would ever choose her. It was in these moments of raw honesty that we began to see how deeply we connected. We were both just two people, yearning for love but afraid of it, learning how to open up when the world had often taught us to close off. Yet, it wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension, misunderstandings, words spoken in haste, feelings hurt. I struggled with expressing my emotions, particularly when it came to vulnerability. I had spent so many years avoiding conflict, keeping my emotions bottled up, afraid that showing too much would push her away. But slowly, I began to learn that being vulnerable with her was not a weakness, it was a strength. She didn't want perfection, she wanted honesty. And as I learned to be more open, she did too, and the barriers between us began to fall away. One weekend, we took a trip to the mountains, a small getaway that allowed us to escape the pressures of everyday life. It was there, in the quiet of nature, that I realized just how much I had changed. There was a moment when we were sitting on a rock, overlooking a valley, and I felt completely at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer afraid of the future. For the first time, I wasn't worried about what would come next. I was content in the present, with her by my side. It was also during that trip that we shared another first, our first "I love you." It came out of nowhere, the words slipping from my lips as we sat watching the sun set behind the mountains. I had never been one to say those words lightly, but in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. And when she looked at me, her eyes full of warmth, she said it back, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't need anything more. Wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a sweeping romance, it was simply the truth. The next few months were a mix of challenges and triumphs. There were moments when I questioned whether we were truly ready to navigate a relationship so new, so uncharted. We were still learning about each other, still figuring out how to balance our individuality with our growing bond. There were times when we fought over trivial things, like how often we saw each other or who forgot to do the dishes. But even in those moments, there was an underlying understanding that we were both in this together, trying to build something real. And that's when I realized something profound. It wasn't the grand gestures or the big milestones that defined our relationship, it was the little things. It was the way she always made sure I had my favorite tea ready when I came home after a long day. It was the quiet mornings we spent reading in bed, the soft hum of a shared routine. It was the understanding that, even on the hard days, we would be there for each other, not because we were perfect, but because we were choosing to be there. Looking back, I often find myself reflecting on how much I had changed over the course of that year. From the man who had never been in a relationship, who had convinced himself that love wasn't meant for him, to the person who now had someone to share his life with, someone who understood him in ways he never thought possible. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. And, for the first time in my life, I believed that love wasn't something to be afraid of. It wasn't something that happened to other people, it was happening to me. And as I held her hand for the 1000th time, I realized that love wasn't just a series of firsts, it was an ongoing journey, a constant learning experience. We didn't have all the answers, and we didn't know exactly where this would go. But in that moment, as we sat side by side, I understood that it didn't matter. What mattered was that we had chosen each other, and that, in itself, was enough. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. As the months passed, we found ourselves more entwined in each other's lives, learning how to navigate the complexities of being in a relationship. There were moments of pure joy, where we laughed together so hard it felt like the world was just us, a quiet space where nothing else mattered. But there were also moments of discomfort, of growing pains that come with any first relationship. We were both still figuring out how to love and be loved, how to balance our needs with the needs of the other person. One evening, after a disagreement about something insignificant, a miscommunication about weekend plans, we found ourselves sitting in the living room, the air thick with the unspoken tension between us. I had never been great at confrontation. My instinct was always to retreat, to pull back when things got tough. But this time, something inside me told me not to run, not to hide from the discomfort. Instead, I sat there, facing her, trying to understand what had gone wrong. It wasn't just about the argument, it was about learning how to communicate, how to be honest about our feelings without letting them fester into resentment. I remember watching her, her eyes filled with emotion, and for the first time, I saw her not as someone perfect or idealized, but as a person with her own struggles, her own fears. It was a realization that caught me off guard. It wasn't that I hadn't seen her flaws before, but in that moment, I truly understood how much we both had to give and take from each other. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being real. I reached out, slowly, my hand trembling slightly. She didn't pull away. Instead, she took it, and in that simple gesture, we found our way back. We didn't have all the answers, and we didn't know exactly how to fix things, but in that moment, I realized that love wasn't about never fighting. It was about finding the strength to come back together after the storm, to rebuild the bridge that had momentarily faltered. As the year drew to a close, we found ourselves reflecting on the journey we had taken together. We had learned more than we could have imagined. We had learned the importance of patience, of giving space when needed, of holding tight when the world seemed uncertain. We had learned how to trust both ourselves and each other. There were still moments of doubt, still times when I questioned whether we were both ready for the kind of love that lasted, but there was also something deeper that told me we were stronger than I had ever given us credit for. It wasn't about the grand gestures, the milestone moments, or even the milestones we had yet to reach. It was about the quiet moments, the mornings we spent over coffee, the evenings when we lay in bed talking about everything and nothing, the small ways we showed up for each other when life got hard. It was about learning how to be vulnerable without fear, how to be imperfect together, and how to find strength in one another. And one day, sitting on the same couch where we had had that tough conversation months ago, I realized something I had never thought possible. I loved her, fully, completely, not just for the moments when things were easy, but for the moments when they were difficult too. I loved her because she was my first, my beginning, the person who had opened me up to a world I had once thought would always be out of reach. She had taught me that love wasn't about waiting for the perfect person, but about finding someone who made you feel like you could be your most authentic self. Looking back on everything, our first kiss, the first time we held hands, our first fight, our first I love you, I realized that those firsts didn't just represent the beginning of our relationship. They represented the beginning of something deeper, something more profound than I had ever imagined. They represented the fact that love, no matter how new or unfamiliar, was worth every step. It was worth every uncertainty, every leap of faith. I thought about the man I had been before I met her, the one who never thought he would find love, who never believed he could be worthy of it. That man had been afraid to reach out, to risk getting hurt. But now, with her, I was learning to take risks, to open my heart even when it felt vulnerable. I was learning that love wasn't a destination, but a journey, and I was no longer afraid of the unknown. As I sat there, her head resting on my shoulder, her hand in mine, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The future was still a mystery, and we both had a lot of growing to do. But in that moment, I realized that love wasn't about knowing everything. It was about trusting that, no matter what, we were in this together. We had found each other when we least expected it, and though we had no way of knowing where this journey would take us, I knew one thing for sure: we were both willing to take it together, one step at a time. And that, in itself, was enough. With her by my side, I understood that love wasn't just something I would experience once and then be done with. It was a daily commitment, a series of small gestures and quiet moments that built up over time, creating a bond stronger than anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just the firsts that defined us, it was the continuing journey, the ever-growing love that we nurtured every single day. And in that, I had finally found something real, something lasting, something worth fighting for. With her, I had found my place in the world. As the months stretched into a year, our relationship transformed into something deeper than I had ever anticipated. We were no longer just two people navigating the unfamiliar terrain of first love. We had become partners in every sense of the word. We had settled into a rhythm, a routine of shared moments that felt both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Every quiet evening spent at home, every small conversation in the car, every smile exchanged across the room, each of these moments felt like a piece of the puzzle of our lives fitting together, building something solid, something enduring. The challenges didn't disappear, of course. There were times when I found myself retreating into old habits, holding back, unsure of how to fully express myself. There were moments when she, too, felt the weight of vulnerability and questioned whether we were truly ready for the kind of commitment we were building. But through it all, we learned to meet each other halfway, to communicate when it felt difficult, to show up even when the future seemed uncertain. One evening, after an argument over something trivial and an answered text, a misplaced detail, I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window, replaying the conversation in my mind. I felt the familiar pang of doubt that had haunted me in past relationships. Was this it? Was this the moment when everything would fall apart? But then, I heard her footsteps behind me, soft and slow, and I realized that, even in the midst of our frustrations, there was something unwavering between us. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of the silence, not of the tension. We had learned how to weather those storms together. Without saying a word, she wrapped her arms around me from behind, resting her chin on my shoulder. It wasn't the grand gesture of reconciliation, but something far more powerful. It was the quiet, unconditional gesture that said, "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." And in that moment, I knew that this was the kind of love we were building, not one without challenges, but one that had the strength to endure them. We began to take small steps forward, not in the rush of overwhelming declarations, but in the slow, deliberate moments of understanding. We made an effort to listen, not just to hear each other, but to truly understand. There were evenings when we stayed up late, talking about our pasts, our dreams, our fears for the future. I learned about her childhood, the struggles she had overcome, and the quiet strength that had carried her through. She learned about the parts of me I had hidden for so long, the insecurities I had buried deep within, and the lessons I had yet to learn. There was something humbling in sharing those pieces of ourselves with each other, pieces that we had kept hidden for years, afraid of judgment, of rejection. But with her, I found not only acceptance but a gentle encouragement to become the best version of myself. She never pushed me to be something I wasn't. Instead, she celebrated the person I was and gently nudged me to grow, to reach for the potential I had always kept just out of reach. And, as the days turned into months, and the months into years, I began to realize just how much I had changed. I wasn't the same person I had been when we first met, the man who had convinced himself that love was something meant for others, not for him. I had learned to open my heart, to trust in the possibility of forever. I had learned to love not just her, but myself in ways I had never thought possible. There were days when I still felt the shadows of doubt creep in, moments when I questioned whether we were truly meant to be, whether we were strong enough to make it through the inevitable storms that life would throw our way. But every time that doubt arose, I was met with a simple truth. We were building something that was real. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its struggles, but it was real. And that, I realized, was enough. One evening, as we sat on the couch after dinner, she leaned her head against my shoulder, just like she had done so many times before. I traced the outline of her hand with my finger, the way I had learned to do over the years, a silent affirmation of how far we had come. We had no grand plans for the future, no idea of where life would take us, and in that moment, there was a peace that settled between us. It wasn't just about the milestones we had passed, the anniversaries, the vacations, the small moments of joy we had shared. It was about the quiet certainty that we were in this together. We had learned to face life's challenges not as individuals, but as a team. We were no longer two people stumbling through the unknown. We had become partners, each of us holding the other up when life became too heavy to bear alone. And so, we continued on, day by day, step by step, learning from each other, growing together. Our love wasn't the fairy tale kind. It wasn't flawless or without its trials, but it was real, deep, and lasting. We had built something from the ground up, brick by brick, and every day, it felt more solid, more rooted. Looking back, I couldn't have imagined a more perfect journey. I had never believed that love would come for me, that I would be able to experience the depth of connection that I had always seen in others, but with her, I had found not only love, but a partner, a best friend, a piece of my heart that I hadn't even known was missing. And so, as we faced the future together, and certain as it may be, I knew one thing for sure: we had something worth fighting for. We had built a love that was real, built on the foundation of trust, patience, and understanding. And no matter what came our way, we would face it together, hand in hand, hearts intertwined. This wasn't the end of the story. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that I had once thought was never meant for me. But here I was, with her by my side, ready to continue writing our story, one day at a time, and in that, I found peace.